The last addition strategy I'm going to present is an open number line. This takes the number lines that you've been working with for a long time and lets you have some creativity and lets you have some flexibility on how big your jumps are and how many jumps you're going to take. The steps to completing the open number line are: number one, choose an add-in to start with. I usually start with the larger of the two add-ins. With the second add-in, think of some ways you can make it. This is when we are combining our open number line with our expanded form, because usually that's the easiest way to start breaking apart your numbers. Choose one of these equations to be your plan for making your jumps, but you might also find that as you're in the middle of creating your number line, you might have to make other changes to your plan. Step 2 is to make a jump for your largest place value. Write the length of your jump underneath the loop. Step 3 is to write where you land on the number line. Next, you get to the 0. And what I mean by that is you get to the next number that has a 0 in the one spot. Write the size of your jump underneath the loop and then write where you landed on the number line. Step 5 is to make your last set of jumps. Write the size of the jump under the loop and write where you land on the number line. That will be your answer. My third strategy for you for adding with regrouping is an open number line. Now, as much as I do love using the break apart method to add, an open number line is very useful, and you will find that it becomes your best math friend, mostly because you can use it in all sorts of situations. So the first one we're going to start with is just adding large numbers. Step 1 for adding your numbers is decide which number you're going to start with. I usually choose to start with the larger number, but it truly doesn't matter. So 678 is my larger number. So I'm going to label that on my number line, and that's going to be my starting point. For your second add-in, you are going to break it apart, mostly using expanded form. And the reason for that is that's going to help you figure out how to make your jumps the easiest. So one way we could break it apart is 200 plus 10 plus 5. We could do it 200 plus 15. I might end up finding that I would decide to break it apart another way. Regardless, I'm going to make my first jump the largest of my place values. So that's my jump of 200. So I draw my big long jump and I put 200 underneath the loop part. That's to show that the jump is 200 spaces long, because nobody wants to have to write 200 little marks. This lets you do one giant jump, and then you can write down where you land. If I start at 658 and I jump 200, I land at 878. Now, the next thing I always say to do is get to the 0. And all that means is when we have a 0 in the ones place, it makes it really easy for us to play around with the number. To get to the next number with a 0 in the ones place, I would have to add 2. That would get me, do my little tiny jump of 2 here, that would get me to 280. If you look up here, I haven't written anything that has a 2 in it, but I can look at this and look at 15 as 2 plus 13. So I've already done my jump of 200. I can X that out. I've done my jump of 2. That gets me to my 0. And now I'm going to do my jump of 13. And because I already have a 0 here, it's really easy for my brain to think 280 plus 13 is 293. 678 plus 215 equals 293. Let's do another practice problem using the open number line. My problem is 346 plus 572. And step 1 is always to decide which add-in you're going to start with. Now, even though 572 is the second number written, I'm going to start with that because the commutative property of addition says I can switch the order of the numbers and it's still going to get me the same answer. So because it's the larger number, it's going to mean fewer jumps and a little bit easier for me to think through. So I'm going to record 572. Then I'm going to go through and figure out some different ways that I can make 346. I could do 300 plus 40 plus 6. I could do 300 plus 46. For right now, I'm going to choose this number sentence to get started with, but as I'm creating my number line, I might find that it makes more sense to divide up these numbers in a slightly different way. I'm going to start with my biggest place value jump, which is 300. So I do a nice long loop. I write 300 in there, and 572 plus 300 is 872. Now, mathematicians, sometimes our jumps get a little too big or a little too small, and it really doesn't matter. As long as you write how large your jump is underneath the loop, it's not going to matter if your 300 jump is this big or even just this big. That's why we label it, so that you don't have to make sure that your jumps are the exact right size of 300. Because if this is my jump of 300, it's going to be hard to figure out what my jump of 40 is going to be. I'm at 872. I'm going to mark out my 300 because I've already used it. I don't want to accidentally add it again. And if I decide to change how these numbers look, I want to make sure that I'm keeping track of the numbers that I've added in. I'm at 872. And normally, my next step is to get to the 0. But if I try and use my 6, I never actually get to the 0. And I don't want to regroup here to make it an 8 because that doesn't really help me. So I am going to go ahead and add in my 6. And even though it doesn't get me to the 0, I don't have to do any regrouping. I don't have to work very hard to think what the answer is, so it's a nice one to get on the board. And I land at 878. Now I have this 40 left, and I know that I'm going to be adding it into that 7 part of my number because they have the same value. They're both in the 10 spot. Or I have a little confession to make. 4 plus 7 is actually one of my really hard math problems to figure out. I always have to do extra thinking about it. And one of the nice things about using an open number line is you can make it work for you. So I am not going to add just that 40 to it. I'm going to break 40 down into 20 plus 20 because that is much easier for me to add in than it would be to keep it as a 40. Now, you do what works for you. Maybe you don't have to break it down and you can see how to get that answer without any problems. Maybe you decide to break it down into 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10. It doesn't matter as long as you do a jump of 40. So I'm going to go jump of 20. And that puts me at 898. And then I mark off that 20 so I remember that I used it. And I've got one more 20 left. And that puts me at 918. So for me, that was a much easier way to go through and add that 40 in, but you do whatever's easiest for you. No matter what though, if you look here, you're gonna have 300 plus 40 plus 6 and have your 346. As long as whatever is under your loops matches the amount of your second addend, you've made sure you've gotten all the parts in. So 346 plus 572 equals 918.